Hi folks, I'm coming on to do a longer video today because I want to talk all about dysautonomia. Now, there have been times in the past when I have been very resistant to do videos on specific conditions. And that is because I sometimes kind of see it as missing the point. Because really all specific diagnostic labels are here are some symptoms that tend to come together. Let's give it a name, right? It doesn't really tell us why the condition has developed or how to approach supporting the body in order to reverse the condition. And so because really all chronic illnesses have just a few similar root causes. If I was going to do videos on every different chronic illness condition out there, I would just be constantly repeating myself, right? Because even though there are hundreds and thousands of, labels and diagnoses out there, there is just a handful of root causes, and they are just manifesting different ways in the body, right? So I've been hesitant to do these specific condition videos, but at the same time, dysautonomia has become such an epidemic because it is often experienced post severe infection, and because we've, had the experience in the world we've had the last few years. Unfortunately, the numbers of people with this condition are really skyrocketing, and it is because it is in the nervous system, the symptoms are often very vague. They are very often kind of non-specific, but they're very debilitating. And so a lot of conventional doctors really don't know how to handle this. And they never really have, right? I mean, this is not a new condition. People have been having this condition for a long time. But because the rates are so much higher after the last few years than they ever were before, we're really seeing this gap in knowledge a lot more distinctly, where people are really again experiencing these very debilitating symptoms without a lot of answers. There's a few medications that are being promoted that do help, for some people. For some people, they also give really gnarly side effects or even make the symptoms worse. And they're certainly not an answer, right? They're not like a cure-all situation. And so I do think it's important for me to come on here and get a little more specific with this one in terms of what is actually going on in the body. Why it's developing, and what the core things we can do to help heal are. Now, obviously, this is going to be a major overview. I am actually going to be dedicating an entire online course to this topic, to these types of dysautonomia spectrum conditions, and chronic fatigue and things like that. When I do my big launch of my new book and my new courses in January, one of them is going to be specific to this stuff. So I'm going to take people through really step by step in that course. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to give out a ton of detail in this video, but I'm going to give you a really solid overview so that you have a place to start. So first of all, let's just start with the basics. Dysautonomia is an umbrella term. So that means there are a lot of more specific conditions under this overarching umbrella. But basically, it just means that there's dysregulation happening in the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, right, is the part of the nervous system that is more unconscious, right? It's like coming from the brainstem, from the very primal parts of our brain. It's the things that we don't really have to consciously think about that are just happening in our body. Even while we're asleep, right? We don't have to consciously think about it. So this is like our digestive processes, it's our heart rate, it's our breathing rate, it's our temperature regulation, it's all this kind of stuff. And so any kind of symptom that shows consistent, like patterned dysregulation in any of those systems is basically could be under the umbrella of dysautonomia. So there are some more specific conditions under that umbrella where people have, more specific symptomology, right? So there's post-orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, which is one of the more prevalent ones. And then there's orthostatic hypotension, there's vasovagal syncope, there's sinus tachycardia. There's a lot more than that, but these are the common things that you will see on people's medical charts when they get a more specific diagnosis. Um, and then there are people that have symptoms that don't really fit neatly into any of those categories, and so that would just be kind of under the basic umbrella of dysautonomia, and you can just kind of have a general diagnosis of that as well. Now, again, from my perspective, I don't think it really matters what specific subtype of the condition you have is. It's just how it happens to be manifesting in your nervous system, right? And there's just a lot of little factors that we can't always explain as to why it's manifesting exactly the way that it is. The point is, your autonomic nervous system is dysregulated. That's like the main thing that is really important to understand. So my symptoms when I was ill, and this was long before what's happened in the last few years. I had it and recovered for it before any of this happened. Um, I was more under the realm of just basic dysautonomia. By the time I realized what the symptoms were that I was having, I had kind of started to write off the conventional medical world already, so I never formally pursued a diagnosis. I don't know if someone would have been able to fit me into a more specific diagnostic criteria. I didn't really care at that point. I didn't really think it mattered, but I definitely had symptoms of dysautonomia where I was having things like low blood pressure, I was having a lot of heart irregularities, I was dizzy all the time. I had extreme muscle weakness and fatigue. Um, let's see, those were the primary symptoms that I really had. But a lot of people also have vertigo, breathing irregularities. I had that as well, actually. And then a lot of like visual and auditory weirdness. A lot of people just describe it as just like weird neurological symptoms, right? Where they're just not integrating like visual and auditory stimuli appropriately, or they're having just weird sensory experiences, temperature dysregulation. A lot of people have really bad sleep disorders along with this, like their whole hormonal system is just kind of flipped, and they have really bad insomnia, really poor quality of sleep. So any of these kinds of things in the autonomic nervous system. Digestive issues like gastroparesis is really common with this too. Like the digestive tract is just not being stimulated properly, and there's just dysregulation happening there. A lot of people have a lot of bloating, things like that. So you can see how this can be really hard to diagnose and treat because it's the autonomic nervous system, so it is related to every system in the body, and how our conventional medicine system is set up, it really likes to look at areas discretely, right? And so a lot of people with this condition, they're seeing someone for the neurological things, they're seeing someone for the gastrointestinal things, they're seeing someone for the hormone imbalances. It's and the reality is it's really all in the root of the autonomic nervous system, right? And so all these kind of disparate symptoms can really be explained in this nice package. Now that being said, there are some things that aren't necessarily directly related to dysautonomia, but that are very common overlaps due to the underlying root causes, which I will talk about in a minute. But I just want to say that it's very normal to have these overlapping conditions as well, and that includes EDS. And a lot of people who develop dysautonomia don't realize that they have some type of hypermobility issue, or collagen synthesis issue is really what it is. But collagen is a huge part of the raw material of our nervous system. And so if we have collagen synthesis issues, sometimes it can really contribute to dysautonomia symptoms, right? Basically our nervous system is like physically weak, like structurally. So those types of collagen disorder conditions, hypermobility, are very, very big overlap. Different types of neuropathy, where you actually start to get damage and dysregulation in the peripheral nervous system as well as the central nervous system. So this would be like trembling, buzzing, numbing, tingling sensations, even really sharp pain sometimes people experience, just with the damage that starts to happen in the nerves. And then histamine disorders, mast cell activation, histamine intolerance, all this kind of stuff is also very, very common as an overlap. And again, it has to do with some of the root causes of the condition. So I'll talk more about that in a bit. But basically, the nervous system and the immune system are very, very tied together. And so most people with dysautonomia have some kind of dysregulation in the immune system happening as well. And this can result in the MCAS type symptoms. Okay, so that's all the ways it can manifest, all the things it can overlap with, as you can see, and if you probably know if you're watching this video, it can range from like I can kind of function, if I'm careful, and I'm very conscious of how I'm handling myself, and I make sure I sit down a lot, and I bring a packet of salt with me everywhere I go. I mean, more mild versions, people can kind of get through life or get through their day, but it can range all the way from that, like, I can get by, but I don't have a good quality of life, to like I'm completely debilitated, bedbound, can't even take a shower, these kinds of situations. So there is definitely a spectrum of seriousness here, but it doesn't lend to a great quality of life no matter what. And so we definitely do want to talk about how it develops, what the root causes are, because if we know what the root causes are, we know what we need to target in order to heal. And people do heal from this condition. I know that a lot of times people talk about it as an incurable condition. It is not an incurable condition. There are root causes, and there are key things you can do to help support your body to heal spontaneously from this condition. So, obviously, I'm going to talk in some generalities here. There's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be people who have unusual cases, right? So, I always get comments like, well, my mom's cousin, it was actually this. And, like, yes, there are all sorts of different things that can happen. Everyone is unique. But generally speaking, these are the common factors involved. So, first of all, people who end up developing dysautonomia often have a particular set of life experiences and a particular personality type developing from those life experiences. They may have an underlying temperament or tendency as well in their nervous system. So these are the high stress trauma people, high anxiety, high worry people. I am not excluded from this. So when I am talking about this, no, I'm talking about myself too. I'm not pointing a finger at anyone. This is just the reality. So people who develop these kinds of severe dysregulation in the autonomic nervous system often do have a history of trauma. And this can be acute trauma, like shock trauma, for sure. That's very, very common. Someone who's been in a bad accident or had a really serious experience of abuse. It often can be more like in a dynamic, right? It might be more like long-term developmental trauma or complex PTSD, where there are just a lot of really intense dysfunctional qualities in formative attachment relationships growing up, that cause people to basically assume the worst about the world, about other people, and about themselves, right? So these experiences of chronic stress, chronic trauma, people who develop these conditions tend to be perfectionists or have very high expectations for themselves or put themselves under a lot of pressure, who have really pushed their nervous system really hard. I see a lot of people who have used a lot of psychiatric medications, who have used like excessive amounts of caffeine or other substances, or over-exercised or restricted, food, who have these patterns of just these kind of obsessive, like perfectionistic, anxious, high stress behaviors. Very, very common history with this. And basically, it gets your body into a state where it constantly thinks that you are in danger. And this is likely was very true at some point, and maybe at a lot of points in life, right? I mean, most of these people, they didn't develop this personality type for no reason, right? Like, they had real experiences of trauma and stress in their lives. They had really excessive pressure and expectations on them that they very internalized, have very low self-worth, forth, very highly self-critical, highly anxious, worry a lot, always want to do everything right. And this basically sets their nervous system up to be in a chronic freeze state, right, where everything is terrifying all the time. And dysautonomia is, if we're really going to oversimplify things, a manifestation of a chronic freeze response, right? If you think about it, like all the weakness, all the temperature dysregulation, the severe fatigue, the irregular heart rate, the low blood pressure that happens, all of these kinds of things are often manifestations of a body stuck in a chronic freeze survival response. Now, the body is trying to come out of this freeze response a lot of the time, but it's not getting the supports that it needs, right? So it's going from this highly dissociated state to this hyper mobilized state, fight or flight state, right? That is very high activation in the nervous system. But usually the stressors going on, the nervous system can't really get away from in a classic survival sense, right? Because a lot of times now it's this internalized experience of the world being dangerous, of feeling like you're never good enough, never doing enough, or being in these highly dysfunctional caregiving type relationships, whatever it is. You can't just run away from that, with our classic fight or flight survival techniques. And so the body tries to mobilize and activate and get out of this freeze state, but it doesn't have the proper supports in place, right? And so it's basically just bouncing back between these different types of survival states, and it's very disorienting for the nervous system, very overwhelming from the nervous system, and this is how you kind of get stuck in a feedback loop, right, in the nervous system. So basically, there's these extreme stressors the nervous system is experiencing that it cannot resolve. Now, this really sets the stage for developing dysautonomia. It doesn't mean, obviously, everyone with this personality type or with this history will develop dysautonomia. There's a whole lot of other things that you could develop as well, right? Some people will, develop, more psychiatric type of issues, or other types of physical health issues that won't manifest as strongly in the autonomic nervous system. But this is very common with people who do end up developing dysautonomia. But there are other factors involved as well. And it is not a coincidence that a lot of people develop dysautonomia after a major acute infection. And so, again, not everyone is going to get a cold, or, get, a infection and immediately develop dysautonomia. Most people get these kinds of acute infections and they are totally fine afterwards, right? Their body is resilient. But usually it's people who have had underlying gut dysbiosis for a long time already. And a lot of people don't know that they have underlying imbalance in their gut and that their immune system is not really at full capacity. And this is why you have this experience of people being like, I was fine and then I got sick and then I was never the same. That's probably not actually what happened. It's just the body can kind of fake it and maintain for a really long time, even though when there's a lot of chronic infections happening in the microbiome under the surface, right? And so this is where people will feel like they really just got hit out of nowhere, but there was a lot of stuff percolating under the surface for a long time, usually for these people. So there's already an underlying chronic infections usually, and then boom, an acute infection just really wipes them out because the immune system isn't really working at full capacity with all that history of chronic infection. So a lot of people historically have gotten dysautonomia after EBV. Mono, right? The chronic infection form of mono. So that has historically a lot of dysautonomia developing. Um, I actually got it after shingles. I got it after a really gnarly shingles infection when I was 25. I got shingles and I was never the same. But this is a perfect example, right? Because a 25-year-old should not get shingles, right? This is like usually like a 60-year-old with a compromised immune system is the type of person that usually gets shingles. I was 25. I got a gnarly case of shingles. I shouldn't have gotten that. It shows how compromised my immune system was already, and probably that I had a lot of chronic infections going on already that were making my immune system not be at full capacity. But I never really fully recovered from that infection, and dysautonomia developed, over the next year. A lot of people get it after international travel. Their immune system is not prepared to deal with a new type of pathogen they've never encountered before in a part of the world they've never been in before. So that's very common as well. And then obviously with what's been happening in the last couple years, it's a particularly gnarly pathogen that has really been hitting people very hard, and so developing this condition. Now, there's a reason why there tends to be this like acute infection and then the development of these symptoms, and that is nutrient depletion. So, in addition to there being underlying chronic infections that have usually been percolating for a long time, um, usually there have been chronic nutrient deficiencies as well. So, a lot of people who end up developing dysautonomia had borderline nutrient deficiencies for quite some time. And then we don't realize how many nutrients we actually use when we fight infections. We use a huge amount. This is why people get really hungry after they're sick, right? Because they have to refeed these key nutrients. Fortunately, a lot of people aren't refeeding themselves properly and probably haven't been their whole life after just run of the mill colds and strep throat and ear infections and things like that. And so, again, a lot of people are right on that edge of nutrient deficiency, and then they get hit with a really serious infection and just completely wipes out the rest of their nutrient stores. And we also get depleted from nutrients when we are experiencing stress and trauma. The creation of stress hormones, the neurotransmitters involved with trying to overcome stressful experiences, again, actually takes a lot of nutrients to create all of those. We don't really think about, we have this RDA idea stuck in our head, and that is not relevant when we're talking about, people under high amounts of stress, high amounts of trauma, having these really intense experiences of illness and infections. The RDA is woefully inadequate when we're talking about those kinds of experiences. And so there are key nutrients that, when depleted, cause the symptoms of dysautonomia, right? That causes dysregulation in the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system needs key nutrients in order to refeed itself. So, a lot of these are the B vitamins. So, a lot of people with dysautonomia have very severe B vitamin deficiencies, especially B1. And there's actually a really interesting history of dysautonomia in Japan and China in the late 1800s, when they were eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, white rice, and they weren't eating enough pork and seafood along with it. And people were actually dying of dysautonomia, not understanding how nutrients work and that they were missing key nutrients in their diet. Um, so B1, B6, B2, B12, these are all really important vitamins to make sure the autonomic nervous system is functioning properly. Also, amino acids, especially choline, is really important for the firing of the vagus nerve, which is a huge part of our autonomic nervous system. We also need a lot of minerals. Minerals is like the spark of our nervous system, right? And these also get very depleted in infections and in stress. So magnesium, zinc. Usually people need high amounts of electrolytes like potassium and sodium when they are healing from dysautonomia, way, way, way above the RDA again. And then, of course, there are more like the physical building blocks, right? So these are our fats and collagen and proteins, right? So we need a lot of the raw material from animal foods in order to replenish our raw material, right? And really do a lot of repair where there's been a lot of damage. So saturated fat and collagen sources in the diet are super, super important with this. Um, this is why I like a ketogenic diet for healing dysautonomia. So we need our metabolism really functioning at full capacity when we are trying to do this level of healing. We can't have any metabolic stress, any metabolic dysfunction going on, or our body's really going to be distracted and inflamed and not able to fully and properly heal. So a ketogenic diet puts us into a really therapeutic metabolic state that can really supercharge our healing. And it also naturally gives us a lot of these nutrients that I'm talking about needing. We are able to get a lot of saturated fat, a lot of collagen in the diet if we're eating in a ketogenic way. So really, really beneficial. A lot of these nutrients, I find that people do have to supplement, though. They are so depleted in these nutrients that they just can't quite get enough from food. Once you reach a certain level of deficiency, sometimes the nutrients from food just is not quite enough to get you back to a baseline. So eventually, I always like to see people be able to maintain restored nutrient levels with food, but sometimes you do have to supplement in the beginning, especially with the electrolyte issue. So yeah, we don't want any high carbohydrate, high sugar amounts in the diet because we want the metabolism to be in a super healthy, super optimal state, and we want to really target those key nutrients. Um, Also, a low carbohydrate diet is really good at resetting the gut microbiome, right? So eventually it is helpful to add more plant matter, add more starch into the diet to kind of rebuild the good bacteria, right? But in the beginning, this is another reason a very strict ketogenic diet can be very, very helpful when done properly in a whole foods kind of way, where you take all sugar and starch out of the diet and you really work on healing that gut and getting rid of any chronic infections that are basically sucking nutrients out of your immune system and contributing to these dysautonomia symptoms being prolonged. Okay, so yeah, talked about chronic infections, healing the gut, getting your immune system functioning at full capacity, refeeding key nutrients that the nervous system needs in order to rebuild and function properly. And then it really is about hang on one second. I'm gonna plug my computer in. And then it really is about the stress trauma piece, right? Because that was the initial thing that I talked about, was that dysautonomia tends to be related to someone who has a history of trauma, a history of high stress, a history of a very anxious, self-critical personality type that tends to always see the bad in everything, that tends to constantly be worried about everything, that really puts a lot of pressure on themselves to perform in a certain way. And this is where I see people getting tripped up who are doing all the supplements, they're doing all the diet, they're doing all the nutrition stuff, and yet they are not seeing the results they really want. And we really need to do a full personality overhaul when we are trying to heal this type of condition. Keeping your same daily routines, watching the same thing on TV, listening to the same music, talking to the same friends a lot of the time, having the same thinking patterns, perceiving yourself in the same way you always have, all of this stuff is going to be an obstacle to your healing, honestly. And I know it's really scary to think about overhauling your personality. A lot of this kind of really deep nervous system healing means that you have to really shed who you thought that you were and really rebuild yourself and really become a different person, and really take this as an opportunity. Again, I am speaking from my own experience as well. I'm not calling anyone out, but this is the reality that I see a lot, right? People who take this experience as an opportunity to really surrender to transformation, like true transformation, where you are learning to think differently about yourself and the world. You're learning to become more at peace with who you are and not what you're expecting yourself to be, right? That you are willing to give yourself totally new inputs. You're willing to turn off the news, turn off the TV, put down your phone. You're willing to completely overhaul your daily routines and the kinds of inputs that your nervous system is getting about what the world is like and who you are like. I mean, this is really what healing from dysautonomia is about at its core. Now, the good news is that as you refeed these kinds of key nutrients I'm talking about and you reset the microbiome, it actually becomes easier to do that because your personality kind of naturally starts changing as the microbes in your body start changing, and as you're actually feeding your brain and your nervous system properly, like, people do start to just organically feel a shift a lot of the time. I have a lot of clients tell me, like, I've never felt so peaceful in my life, even though they still have a lot of symptoms and maybe they haven't fully reversed things. They just start to really feel the difference of what it's like to have a balanced microbiome and properly feeding their brain. So, a lot of times this opportunity really does like present itself to people organically as a part of this journey, but often people do have to do some really intentional change as well and really start retraining their brain to think and exist in a different way, and be willing to again become a different person, to kind of build a new personality. And it's really powerful what can happen when you start to allow those changes. So yeah, this all together will start pulling your nervous system out of a chronic freeze state, and that's really what this is about at its core, is getting your nervous system out of that dysregulated chronic freeze state and back into a more regulated flowing state. So I hope this was helpful. I know it was long, but there's a lot to this. And I just hope you have hope for healing. Like I said, I recovered from this long before the events of the last couple years. And so I feel in some ways really blessed and privileged that I get to provide hope for people that yes, people have recovered from this in the past, people continue to recover from it. It's absolutely possible. It is a long, hard road. The nervous system can really get stuck in a feedback loop, and so it does take a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of work, but it is possible. And I'm really excited to be putting my book out in a couple months, and a course dedicated to this condition. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.